Reflections from Torch Trust, focusing on Christian faith and sight loss.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Reflections from Torch Trust, the show that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. I'm your host, Marilyn Baker. You may recall that back in July we spoke with Bill Skipworth about his life, his journey through sight loss and his faith. Well, Bill has also experienced Charles Bonnet syndrome, a condition where a person who is losing their sight begins to have visual hallucinations. We really wanted to know more about this, so we asked Bill back on the show. Let's hear from him and our producer, Grace, now.
So, Bill, can you tell us about your experience with Charles Bonnet syndrome?
Yes, it's something that was actually horrific at the time. It began when I'd had the operation, which was, was eventually going to bring my sight back. But I was temporarily blinded by the operation, and my sight was deteriorating rapidly. And I sat in my living room, and as I sat there, I saw these, what I can only describe as Victorian children on a toboggan. And I mean, this was sort of when it was, summertime, and they were riding in the back garden. They came through the patio window, sort of like magically through the patio window. The toboggan was going around the living room, and then it went through the patio window again into the garden. And there were sort of arms wrapped around each other, obviously having a great time. And at that point, the Charles Bonnet syndrome, I was actually entertained. It was all in silence, obviously. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And then, the vision, as I would call it, went, and that was it. But that was the first inkling that something strange was beginning to happen. And, of course, I'd already known about Charles Bonnet because of the, SRSB organisation that I'm involved with in Sheffield. They have a Charles Bonnet group, and I did know that there was this condition for people with severe sight loss. But in the book that I've written about Charles Bonnet, that was just the beginning, because it went absolutely horrific after that.
So because you knew about Charles Bonnet syndrome, when it first happened, did you kind of realise? Did you think, oh, that's what's happening? Or?
Yes, I did actually, because I knew that people suffer from these visions with severe sight loss. When this sort of Victorian children tobogganing incident happened, I thought, oh, that's Charles Bonnet. I'm having an hallucination. It's not real. And of course, at that point, it wasn't scary at all.
Yeah,
it was just really nice. It was a nice experience.
Such a benign vision to have.
Yeah, that's right. It was a really nice, cuddly vision, if you like.
You had some less pleasant visions, didn't you, as well?
Oh, yeah, that was just the beginning. And what really triggered it badly was being in a car. If I was sat in a car, I would look through the window, and again, this is what was very strange, because I know Sheffield in the Second World War was heavily bombed. And weirdly, when I was in the car, the Charles Bonnet conjured up rubble, and then all the houses I looked at all looked bombed out, all sorts of windows broken and roofs caved in, and it was just destruction everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, this is strange, why am I seeing that? But that's what my Charles Bonnet was telling me. I talked to people about this later, and I think what it is that the body realises something's going wrong. Obviously, my body realised that my sight was completely disappearing, and it was like putting up danger signals. But instead of sort of, speaking to me with danger, it was sort of giving visions of danger. So all the visions were like sort of chasms. That was what kept happening. I would walk along a road, and I would think there was a chasm, or I would think there was a brick wall in front of me, or I would think the roof was about to fall on me. It was just danger, danger, danger. And when I was in a car, it was a bit like being on the scariest ride of Alton Towers ever. Honestly, it was. It was just horrendous.
Oh, that's
really
so frightening, because even if you know that it's a syndrome, it must still feel very real, and it could be hard to tell what is real. And
that's right. And you see, I quickly realised that, I had my wife with me, and I knew that obviously she knew what I was experiencing, and I knew that when I had hold of her hand, that even though I saw a brick wall in front of me, I knew it wasn't there. So I just trusted totally in my wife. And of course, when we came to the what I thought was a brick wall, it just disappeared. It was just like magically disappeared, and we apparently, to me, walked through the brick wall and fences and things like that. It was very peculiar, because in Charles Bonnet you have to realise it isn't real, although it appears real.
And I know you mentioned your experience where you thought you were about to sit on someone as well. That must have been...
Oh, yeah. Well, again, this is the other strange thing was. I mean, in a way, that was quite comical, because we'd gone into a cafe, and my wife tried to sit me in this chair, which I thought there was this very large woman, in fact, like Hyacinth Bouquet. I mean, it wasn't Hyacinth Bouquet, but she looked like it. You know, very large lady. And she was sat there and in this chair, and my wife was trying to push me into her lap, you see. Yeah. And of course I was sort of fighting her and sort of trying to stop her from pushing me into the chair. So of course anybody looking at us would see this couple sort of fighting, well, apparently sort of shoving and pushing each other in the middle of the cafe. But eventually, with a superhuman effort, she pushed me onto the chair. And of course, immediately the woman disappeared. It was a normal chair.
Oh dear.
And again, that was a comical aspect of it. But again, most of the aspects of the visions was horrific. It was just danger, all of it. Yeah. But again, people. The lady who's sort of doing some research on a PhD that she's doing on Charles Bonnet, and she said it's quite common to get visions of Victorian children or Victorian people, which is rather strange, isn't it?
Yeah, how strange.
Very strange, yeah. And again, I wondered if there was some kind of, you know how people talk about an atmosphere, you know, because of the awful destruction in the Second World War in Sheffield. I don't know how in some way my brain picked up this sort of the past in the atmosphere of the city. Which is very strange, isn't it?
It's very interesting. Yeah.
There's
a whole lot more to learn about that.
Oh yeah, but certainly. But the other interesting thing is that if you've got Charles Bonnet syndrome, you need a guide, you know, because of course you're believing that all these awful things are happening, but they're not.
Yeah.
And the big thing is to have somebody that you know hasn't got it, and of course, you know, ignores all what you think is there, you know, these horrific things that are around.
Someone that you completely trust.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, it's very true. And this lady talks about this actually in this PhD she's doing, which is interesting. But again, it's very, very variable. You know, my experience would be different to somebody else's experience. It's very strange.
Charles Bonnet is certainly a very interesting condition, and we wanted to learn more. So our producer Grace got in touch with Judith Potts, who runs Esme's Umbrella, a site aimed at raising awareness of the syndrome and helping people to find support and information. Let's hear from Judith now.
I'm not a doctor, and I have no medical training at all. What I do know about it, I've learned from Professor Dominic Fitch, who is the sole, actually still globally acknowledged, though, expert in Charles Bonnet syndrome. He started his research in the 1990s, but you have to remember that Charles Bonnet lived a very long time ago. And it was 1760 when he first wrote what was happening to his grandfather. Now, he knew his grandfather was, as he knew, totally sane. So Charles Bonnet, a very clever man, realized it wasn't a mental health issue at all. It must be something to do with the fact that his grandfather had very bad sight. He had cataracts, which obviously in those days were inoperable. And so he wrote it all down, documented everything, and then it was just sort of left. And I think in the 1930s and the 1960s, a couple of doctors wrote a few case studies, called it Charles Bonnet syndrome after him. But that was as far as it went until Dominic started his work, as I say, in the 1990s. And his first piece of research was looking at visual hallucinations from Parkinson's, because you probably know later on in Parkinson's, people can start to hallucinate, in Lewy body dementia, and in Charles Bonnet syndrome. And it was what he learned that made him the only expert really in the world. Then I came along, and I came along because of my mum. My mum was the Esme of Esme's Umbrella. And she was in her early 90s, very independent lady, lived on her own, completed the Telegraph cryptic crossword every day, was absolutely fine. But she had fairly advanced glaucoma. At that time, I knew nothing at all about sight loss or eye conditions or anything. And I didn't realize, I think, properly what glaucoma meant. She was very good at compensating. So sort of between us, we never really talked about it. But then one day when I was leaving her flat, she suddenly said, "I do wish these people would get off my sofa." And I thought, oh no, she's got dementia. And then I thought, but hang on, she can't have dementia because she does this flipping cryptic crossword, which I certainly couldn't do. While I was sort of taking a breath to know how on earth to respond, she said, well, there's also this Edwardian tear-stained street child that follows me everywhere, and a hideous gargoyle-like creature that jumps from table to chair. So I thought, well, I have no idea what on earth is wrong with her. With the most enormous piece of luck, that very day, I read a tiny paragraph about a condition called Charles Bonnet syndrome, which happened to people when they lost their sight. And I thought, well, that's exactly what's happened to her. So I gave her a call and I said, don't worry, I know what this is. I will ring your ophthalmologist. And that's when it all went wrong, because he refused to discuss it.
Oh.
I said, I'm pretty sure this is what she's got. What do I do? He said, I don't talk about that. Tried the GP. The GP had never heard of it. I thought I was being fanciful. And the optometrist had never heard of it. I thought, I've got to do something about this. So I went online, and that's where I found Professor Dominic Fitch. And I was writing a health column at that time for the Telegraph. So I rang him and I said, could I possibly come and see you? Because I would like to write about this condition, but also I need to just make sure you think that's what my mum has. Went to see him. He confirmed, yes, that's exactly what she's got. He told me it was not a mental health issue of any kind. And he explained to me why it happened. And I don't know, do you know the explanation? Should I tell you the explanation?
Oh, please do tell me, yeah.
Okay. So when you have full sight, there are messages which run all the time from the retina in the eye to the visual cortex in the brain. When sight diminishes, those messages slow down or stop entirely. But for some reason, we still don't understand, the brain doesn't calm down. The brain fires up and creates its own images. We assume it's because it's so used to interpreting something that's sent to it from the eyes, and as nothing is coming, it just decides to do something of its own. What you see depends on which part of the brain is firing at that moment, because there are different sections which will show you or will explain to you that it's a cat or a snake or a field or whatever it might be. So it depends which part is firing. And so having heard all that, I said, well, I think I'm going to start writing in my column. And I did, and was inundated with emails from people who were either just reassured that this was not a mental health condition, or who wanted more information, or who wanted to tell me their stories. And so I kept writing, and the situation got much worse for my mum. She was seeing images 24 hours a day, really, and it was awful. There was no help, nothing. So she then died, and I continued to write about this. And a couple of years later, I received an email from a professor at a university in New York who told me the story of her mother, who'd been put into a dementia unit because she was hallucinating worms and slugs on her food and in her drink. She could not get past those worms and slugs. Clearly, no one had heard of Charles Bonnet. So the doctor said, no, she's demented. She has to go into a unit where she'll be looked after. Unfortunately, she wasn't properly looked after because, as I say, no one had heard of it. And so she stopped eating and drinking and died, which was just terrible. So that's when I said to Dominic, I think we should do something. Would you help me if I started a campaign? And he said, absolutely, yes. So November 2015, at the House of Commons, I launched Esme's Umbrella in memory of my mum. And I used the umbrella because I wanted to shelter everybody with this horrible condition, and then see what we could do to find ways of raising awareness, of supporting people, and also of finding funds for research. And one of the first things I did was to work with a very eminent ophthalmologist here called Professor Andrew Dick, and another in America whose name is Dr. August Kohlenbrander, wonderful name. And we persuaded the World Health Organization to give Charles Bonnet syndrome a coding in its taxonomy of diseases and conditions. The new one will be ICD-11, should be out this year, I hope. And this means that for the first time ever, Charles Bonnet syndrome is considered a condition in its own right and not just a side effect of sight loss. I'm very fortunate because I was sort of overwhelmed by calls to my helpline. And a couple of years ago, the RNIB Eye Health team offered to take the calls for me, which is fantastic. And I was then slightly overwhelmed by emails that came via my website from America and Canada, because of course I can't ring them and I would just be answering and sending information, but I just felt, what am I going to do? And then a lovely chap called Gary Cusick, who is a clinical psychologist in Louisville, Kentucky, who works exclusively with the visually impaired, which is not a role we have here. He contacted me and said, can I help? He now also runs an Esme's Friends. I think he runs 2 or 3 actually, online chat and support groups, which is great. Every November since I launched, we've had a patient awareness day. And the first one we advertised, and to our utter astonishment, we had to turn people away. And I realized then that this is not something which is rare. This is very common. And Dominic reckons there are probably 1 million people in the UK who live with Charles Bonnet syndrome.
And do people tend to know that what they're seeing, do they consciously know that it isn't really there, or can it be hard to tell?
On the whole, they know it's not real. As they get older, I think cognitively, it's more difficult to realize that what they're looking at isn't real. And what I say to them is, but just hang on, just think for a moment. If it was a real cat, you wouldn't be able to see it because your eyesight wouldn't allow you to. But it is very hard with the elderly, particularly if there is a little bit of dementia in there as well. You know, in their sort of 90s, there could be some kind of dementia starting, and it's entirely possible to have both. But for the younger people, they know full well that it's not real, but it just interferes with life. Or in Amit's case, it's just so horrible that it makes him feel deeply distressed.
Oh dear. And how can people, if they feel like they could do with some support, they would want to join Esme's Friends, how can people get involved?
Well, if you want to join an Esme's Friends, there is a list on my website. My website is Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and it's Charles Bonnet Syndrome.uk. There's no co, it's just .uk. Or they can email me on esmesumbrella@gmail.com. Or they can ring the helpline, which is 0207 391 3299.
Okay, brilliant.
I think also I worked with the scriptwriters on Coronation Street.
Oh, right, wow.
And in end of February, beginning of March this year, there were 8 episodes which covered a character who developed Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Oh, wow.
And the reaction to that was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, 1,800 calls. I would have had to work 24 hours a day for the rest of my life to raise that sort of awareness.
Yeah.
But those 8 episodes, and in fact, the actor who played the part, Richard Hawley, is now patron of Esme's Umbrella, which is lovely.
Brilliant. Yeah, it shows you how important representation is, doesn't it? That people
Very,
can
yeah.
relate to something. That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. That was really great.
Thank you, Judith. Now we have just a little time left, and today I'd like to share a spiritual reflection with you. This is from my series, Rest for the Heart. Did you realise that before the world was even created, God had you in his mind? This is awesome. He had a plan for your life. He made you for a purpose. He put the exact gifts within you for the things that he wanted you to be. Let's think about some verses that point this out. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realm with every spiritual blessing in Christ, and he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. I do not call you servants any longer, for a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. But I have called you my friends, because I have revealed to you everything that I have heard from my Father. I am not calling you servants, because a master doesn't confide in his servants, and servants don't always know or understand what the master is doing. But I call you my most intimate and cherished friends, for I reveal to you everything I've heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. What then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who is he that condemns? Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. If If you'd like to hear more of Rest for the Heart, just go to marilynbaker.podbean.com. Well, that's all we have time for today. If you'd like to learn more about any of Torch's services, or to leave us a comment or question about the show, do get in touch. You can call us on 01858 438 260. That's 01858 438 260, or you can email info@torchtrust.org. Till next week, from me, Marilyn, and everyone on the Reflections team, goodbye and God bless.
You've been listening to Reflections from Torch Trust.